Namaskar, this is Rick. Welcome to episode 3 of the Dharma series. And today we are going to discuss about the Vaishyas and Shudras. We are going to discuss about Vaishyas according to their social and economic perspective and role in the society. However, our main focus is going to be on the Shudras, how they evolved through generations, what was their main role in the society, and what was their cultural status. And hope this video will clear a lot of misunderstandings regarding how the caste system evolved in India. Our last video was on the Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. If you want to understand this video in a much more better way, then please go through our last videos because this is episode 3. Now, before I start, I would like to apologize for the mistakes that I will make in pronunciations because we are converting Sanskrit into English, so there will be a lot of mispronunciations. And also, if you have any other opinion or any other insights and you would like to share with me, then please post it in the comments so that I become enriched through your knowledge. So, Vaishyas and Shudras. Let's begin. Role and status of Vaishyas in ancient India. So, who are the Vaishyas in ancient India? Etymology and usage. The term Vis and Vaishya denote the third caste. So this means the third caste. In Rig Veda, Vaishya appear only in the Purusha Sukta, while Vis frequently means people. So in Rig Veda, if we go to the earliest book of Indian history, that is Rig Veda, then we find reference of Vaishya only in the Purusha Sukta hymn. However, the term vis means people. Functions and occupations. Later Vedic texts describe Vaishyas as cattle rearers, taxpayers, and community supporters. So they had the three main roles, that is, cattle rearers, and they were taxpayers, and they were also supporters in community activities. They were more numerous than Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. Their population was more, though living separately. Even though they lived separately, their population was more than the Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. Vedic entitlements. Vaishyas were allowed to perform Vedic sacrifices, but their ritual status remained below that of Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. So, even though they participated in the Vedic rituals, their social status came third, that means next to the Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. Exclusive economic roles. Occupations reserved for Vaishyas were Krishi. Krishi means agriculture, and Raksha means animal husbandry. So agriculture and animal husbandry was their main occupation. They also did Vanijya, means trade. They held exclusive rights to practice azari. So to practice azari, they only had rights, and uh, they were actively involved in agriculture, animal husbandry, trade, and commerce. Social hierarchy. Despite their contributions, their social status was ranked lower, but they were economically significant and held distinct professional privileges. So they had professional privileges, they had wealth also, but according to spiritual or social status, they were third. Vaishyas in epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. So this mythological epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, talk a lot about Vaishyas and Shudras. So Ramayana's account. The Ramayana portrays Vaishyas as respectable citizens. When Bharata was to ascend the throne, ministers, relatives, and merchant guilds, which are the Shrenis, awaited the ceremony. So in Ramayana, we find an instance that Ram was going to the forest for 14 years. So at that time, Bharat was to be the caretaker king. So when Bharat was to ascend the throne, that time we find reference that ministers, relatives, and merchant guilds were present in the ceremony. So merchant guilds specifically referred to the Vaishyas. Ceremonial roles. During Ramchandra's coronation, materials like waters were sprinkled by the Naigamas, which are merchants. So, Naigamas were also there in the ceremonies of Ramayana and Mahabharata. Mentioned in governance, Naigamas were consulted by Ramchandra along with his ministers after untimely death of a Brahmana's son. So we find different stories where Vaishyas played a significant role. Vaishya's religious influence. According to Mahabharata, Vaishya also propagated his own religious views, indicating their spiritual agency. So, in their own spiritual agency, Vaishyas had role to propagate their religious views. Mahabharata uses the term dhanina. Dhanina means rich men to refer to Vaishyas, showing that they were regarded as a wealthy community. Shudras, origin and Vedic position. Now we are going to discuss about the fourth caste, that is the Shudras. How did they originate and what was their position in the Vedic culture? So, caste position. Shudra was the lowest of the four varnas. Scholars identified Shudras with dasas and dasayus mentioned in the Rig Veda, though not with absolute certainty. So, dasas and dasyus are mentioned in the Rig Veda, and few scholars believe that they are to be identified with the Shudras. However, this cannot be said with absolute certainty because new researches are being done and new information is coming out almost every year. Rig Veda evidence. So Rig Veda mentions Balbhuta Taruksha receiving gifts like cows from a dasa, indicating that even rich dasas gave acceptable gifts to Vedic minstrels. Now, if you have gone through my last video, then you will know that the Brahmins who performed Vedic sacrificial rituals, they received gifts from the person who was sponsoring the ritual. So, in that case, in Rig Veda, we get an evidence that there was a person named Balbhuta Taruksha who was a dasa, but he gave gifts to the Brahmins, so he must have been very rich. So we get evidence of rich dasas who gave gifts. Religious limitations. The Tandaya Mahabrahmana says that a Sudra, despite owning many beasts, was not entitled to perform sacrifice and was godless, and no deity was created after him. So, this is one of the later Vedic texts which declines or which degrades the position of a Shudra. And here it is mentioned that no matter how many animals a Shudra can own, because animals were sign of wealth. So no matter how many animals are owned by a Shudra, he or she cannot perform Vedic rituals because they are godless and no gods are created in the name of a Shudra. Unlike other three Varnas, the Shudra was said to have been created from the feet and could only wash feet, not go beyond. So the duty of Shudra was only to serve the upper three Varnas. So this is a low ritual role of the Shudras. Despite low status, very rich Shudras could bribe sages to get Brahma Vidya. So there are instances where a lowly Shudra was very rich, so he could bribe the sage and get Brahma Vidya. Chandogya Upanishads narrates how Raivata taught Janashruti Brahma Vidya, calling him a Shudra. So we get evidence where Shudras get Brahma Vidya. And Chandogya Upanishads also narrates the story of Raivata, where we find a Shudra getting Brahma Vidya. Brahma Sutra interprets Shudra not as a caste but sorrow. So, according to Brahmana Sutra, Shudra, the word Shudra means sorrow, deriving words such as from Shuk and Dhru, meaning one overwhelmed with sorrow. So, this is an alternative meaning written in the ancient text about the meaning of the word Shudra. Shudras in Upanishadic and epic texts. So how are Shudras described in Upanishads and the epics Ramayana and Mahabharata? So Chandogya Upanishad. The Chandogya Upanishad also shows Janashruti performing Vedic sacrifices. We have already talked about this. Though later texts like the Tandaya Mahabrahmana limit these acts for Shudra. So Chandogya Upanishad provides a lot of privileges to the Shudras, whereas the Tandaya Mahabrahmana limits many of these acts. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad states Pushan was a Shudra god, which is very significant considering that in many texts it has been mentioned that Shudras were godless, but in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad we find the mention of a god named Pushan, who is believed to be a Shudra god. The Maitrayani Samhita and the Mahabharata list Adityas as Kshatriyas, Maruts as Vaishyas, and Ashwin twins as Shudras. So this is another significant text where Ashwin twins, the gods of animals, they were the gods of animals, twin gods. So they were termed as Shudras according to the Maitrayani Samhita. Atreya Brahmana on Shudras. So what is Aitareya Brahmana saying? Aitareya Brahmana calls the Shudra the servant of another. Anasya Presya. Anasya Presya. So to be expelled at will, which is called Kamothapaya, and to be slain at will, which is called as Yatha Kama Vadya. So thus the Shudras are based solely on the context of serving others, and they can be expelled according to the wish of the owner, and they can also be slain according to the wish of the owner. So Aitareya Brahmana further degrades the position of Shudras in the society. MacDonald and Keith relate these terms to English serfdom post-Norman conquest, indicating that Shudra status reflected conquered serfs under judicial control. So according to MacDonald and Keith, they have drawn a comparative analysis of the position of Shudras with the English serfdom post-Norman conquest. Shudra duties in Manusmriti. So what does Manu say? Manu says Vaishyas should study and trade, whereas Shudras should serve them. So Shudras weren't allowed to perform sacrifices or study scriptures. This is a degradation in the position of Shudras in the later Vedic texts. Prescribed duties and economic role of Shudras. So what are the duties and what are the economic roles of Shudras? So service obligation. Shudras were assigned the sole duty of serving three higher castes according to Manu, and given leftover food, old clothes, corn and bedding. So Shudras were totally at the mercy of the higher three castes, as has been stated by Manusmriti. Livelihood pathways. If Shudra couldn't serve a Brahmana or Kshatriya, he should serve a Vaishya. So even Shudras were sometimes restricted to serve the upper two castes, that is Brahman or Kshatriya. So he was bound to serve a Vaishya. So if unfit for service, he could work as a cook or craftsman. So that has been stated in Karu or Shilpa Manusmriti in volume 10, 99 to 100. So manual skills. Medhatithi explains Karu as carpentry, crafts Shilpa as painting. Kulluka also interprets these as crafts and painting. So they could do carpentry, they could also be involved in crafts and art related or painting activities. Mahabharata states upper castes were obliged to Shudras who sought service. So upper castes were also obliged to Shudras because Shudras sought service. Shudra servants were given clothes, umbrella, fan, ostram and shoes. So all these things were given to the Shudras so that they could serve the upper three varnas. Mahabharata allows Shudras to engage in trade, animal husbandry, crafts, acting, or selling liquor, meat, iron, and leather if unable to find a master. So, if the Shudras do not get a master, then they could conduct their own business, or they could trade, do animal husbandry, and a variety of range of works. So we find that Mahabharata slightly makes the position of Shudras in a much better context, and they are allowed a lot of flexibility, especially in the professional ground. So over time, Shudras monopolized these trades. So if we go through the history, then we will see that Shudras had monopolized certain trades. They dominated in crafts and industry, as Vaishyas has left this for the Shudras, especially leather, meat, liquor, and iron. So these were totally sectors which were dominated by the Shudras. Shudras in administration and Kautilya's Arthashastra. So, how did Shudra play an important role in administration, and what was Arthashastra's view on the Shudras? So, Shudras as ministers. Mahabharata mentions four Brahmanas and one Shudra among eight ministers. So, in the court of Hastinapur, there were eight ministers, and among those eight ministers, one was a Shudra. The Bombay edition includes eight Kshatriyas and 21 Vaishyas in council. So, Bombay edition of Mahabharata also states that there are eight Kshatriyas and 21 Vaishyas in the councils. So, they had a role to play in the administration. Satapatha Brahmana and Manu affirmed that Shudras could hold ministerial roles. Medhatithi confirms this view. So we get from the four texts Mahabharata, Satapatha Brahmana, Manu, and Medhatithi, we get evidence that Shudras could get higher position in administration, mainly ministerial roles. Medhatithi confirms that if king is Shudra, a Brahmana should leave the land, showing bias but accepting a Shudra king. So if there is a Shudra king, then and the Brahmana does not uh, like that, then a Brahman is allowed to leave the land, but he should accept the Shudra as a king. So not only did the Shudras hold ministerial positions, but sometimes they could become kings also. And Brahmana, if they didn't like it, they were free to leave, but they were in no position to reject the Shudra as a king. Pala administration. Pala kings, though Buddhists, often served by Orthodox Brahmanas. Some high offices held by Shudras, suggesting their status wasn't always low. So we find different Pala kings, many of them were Buddhists. The later Pala kings were mainly all of them were Buddhists. So we find that Brahmanas used to work for them, and also Shudras were there in the offices. They held high position in Pala administration, suggesting that they weren't always of low status. Kautilya on Vaishyas and Shudras. So Kautilya defines duties of Vaishya as sacrifice, gifts, agriculture, cattle rearing, and trade. Shudras were assigned service of upper caste, Vrata, Karu, Kushilava karma means acting. So Shudras were mainly reserved to serve the upper caste, whereas a Vaishya could perform many duties like sacrifice, gifts, agriculture, cattle rearing, and trade. So again, Kautilya's Arthashastra degrades the position of Shudras a little bit. Village settlement. Kautilya advised settling villages mostly by Shudra peasants and preferred lower varnas for land grants. Again, we find a privilege given to the Shudras. So, lower varnas were given royal grants, land grants, so that they could practice agriculture. And he has also said that villages must be mostly settled by the Shudra peasants. Military and professions. Kautilya favors Kshatriya army but accepts strong Vaishya and Shudra armies. So, as a leader, there will be Kshatriyas, but Vaishyas and Shudras, if they are strong enough, they are welcome to join the army according to Kautilya. Shudras were allowed all major professions supported by Manu and Mahabharata. So, in this slide, we have discussed that Shudras were not as much low in the society as we think them to be. They were granted certain privileges like ministerial roles and also roles in the army. Next, we will discuss religious and legal disabilities of the Shudras. Now, we will see how Shudras were sometimes at the back end of spirituality and back end of society. So they were excluded from the Vedas. Shudras couldn't study the Vedas or perform Vedic sacrifices. Manu, Kalluka, and Medhatithi confirmed they could perform Pakka Yajnas. So they could perform Pakka Yajnas, but they were not in the main fold of the Vedas. So Shudras could not study Vedas or perform Vedic sacrifices. This was a decision which was taken after 1000 BC, and it was mainly during the later Vedic age when these decisions degrading the position of Sudras were taken. Ritual restrictions. They allowed rituals without mantras. So they could not recite mantras, but they could participate limitedly in the spiritual rituals. Shankar allows spiritual growths and moksha for the Shudras. So spiritual growth and moksha means enlightenment was also for the Shudras, but they were not allowed Vedic chants. That is the decision taken by Shankar. Heavier punishments of Shudras for adultery, rape, and abuse. So, for all these crimes, Shudras received much more harsher punishments. Whereas for the same crimes, lighter punishments were there for Brahmins. Shudras got lighter theft penalties than the Brahmins. However, in case of theft, Shudras had to pay less penalty than the Brahmins. So, Brahmanas and Shudras or every other caste has a disparity in legal matters, especially in the case of judgments. Drinking privileges. Kautilya allowed Shudras to drink and eat freely. According to Kautilya, Shudras can drink and eat freely. However, Shudras falsely claiming Brahmana status could be blinded or fined of 800 panas. So, if a Shudra claims to be a Brahmin, then they would be blinded and they would also have to pay a fine of 800 panas. So, that was the decision taken by Kautilya in Arthashastra. Decline over time. The Apastamba Dharma Sutra allows Aryas or Shudras to prepare food. Later, Manu Yajnavalkya forbade food by Shudras. So later on, they were not even allowed to cook for the upper caste. However, in the previous text, they were allowed all kinds of flexibility, mainly in the Apastamba Dharma Sutra. Paninian classification. Panini classifies Shudras into a Niravishita, means not expelled, and Niravashita. So there were two types of Shudras according to Panini. One was Shudras which were not expelled, another one was Niravashita, means Shudras which were expelled from the society. So among Shudras also there were higher or lower forms. Vatsayana in Kamasutra allows low caste Avarna Varna union for pleasure but not social equality. So a person could marry a Shudra for pleasure. A upper caste person can marry a Shudra for pleasure, but those marriages will not be considered legal. So you can understand how the position of Shudras changed according to time. Previously, they were treated just as another caste who mainly performed labor related activities. But as we evolved, as history went forward, the position of the Shudras declined in such a way that they were even commodities of pleasure. Now we will see how the Smritis dealt with the position of Shudras and what does the historical records of Indian subcontinent say regarding the position of Shudras in the society. So late Smriti discrimination. Later Smritis banned Brahmanas from eating food cooked by Shudras, sharing seeds or touching them, and this led to the practice of untouchability. So Shudras were made untouchable according to the later Smritis, which offered a very orthodox discrimination regarding the Shudras. So this is the later evolution of the Shudras where they are seen to decline. Instructions from Shudras. So Manu allows Brahmanas to approach Shudras or even Chandalas for learning. Mahabharata corroborates this. So according to Manusmriti, if a Brahmin wants to learn something from the Shudras or even the Chandalas who dealt with dead bodies, then Brahmanas are allowed to do that. So, for the purpose of learning, Brahmanas, even the highermost caste, were allowed to learn from the lowermost people in the society, according to Manu. So, this is an exceptional feat where we see Shudras even acting as teachers, and this has been corroborated by the Mahabharata too. In Bengal, Kaivarta chiefs classified as Antayajas seized power. Divya, a Kaivarta ruled Bengal, showing Shudras weren't always barred from power. So there was a fisherman rebellion in Bengal after the Pala Empire. So Kaivarta chiefs, who were Shudras, and one of them was Divya, they ruled Bengal, and thus we can understand the Shudras even became kings. Turkish invasion of Andhra repulsed by Shudra leaders like Pralaya Nayaka and Vema Reddy. Pralaya was called partial incarnation of Vishnu. So we find first of all evidences of Shudra kings. Secondly, their importance in repelling the Turkish invasion. Leaders like Pralaya Nayaka were very and Vema Reddy, they were very good accomplishers in the field of war and battle because they repulsed the Turkish invasion, Islamic invasion, and thus Pralaya Nayak thirdly was called the partial incarnation of Vishnu, where we find a Shudra ruler being equated with a god, one of the most important god in Vedic system. So thus Shudras were in very higher positions during the 14th century. Medhatithi allowed Brahmana to live in a Shudra kingdom, reflecting changing attitudes. So Medhatithi also allowed that a Brahman can live in the Shudra kingdom, and thus there was a change in attitude towards a Shudra. Multiple Shudra kingdoms flourished. Kumarila in Tantra Vatika notes rulers from all varnas. So Kumarila is a writer who in Tantra Vartika says that there were rulers from every varnas. However, he mourns the decline in Brahmana discipline. So he is not at all happy about it, but he can no way ignore the fact that rulers from all varnas were there. Shankara denies sannyasa to Kshatriyas and Vaishyas due to social interaction with Shudras. So Shankar was again a bit more orthodox, and so according to Shankar, if a Kshatriya and Vaishya is associated with a Shudra in some way, then they will not be allowed the status of sannyas. And later texts also reinforce this. So we can see how from the historical records we can understand how the position of Shudras were sometimes very high and sometimes very low. Ramanuja and rigid caste in the Shudra era. So, who was Ramanuja and how was the caste rigid during the Shudra times? So, Ramanuja's incident. Ramanuja, who flourished during 1007 to 1137 AD, lived with Guru Mahapurna. His wife insulted Mahapurna's wife for caste impurity due to shared water with a Shudra woman. So, according to this story of Ramanuja, a Shudra woman could not share water with a woman of other higher caste, and thus the higher caste woman would become impure. So, this was a totally orthodox view regarding the position of Shudras. Ramanuja's response: Ramanuja abandoned his wife and house forever upon learning her actions. His Sri Vaishnava followers still retained caste pride. So Ramanuja was very much proud of his caste, and so because of this so-called sin committed by his wife, he left house. And the Sri Vaishnava followers also carry forward this system of orthodoxy and caste pride. Scriptural justification. Manu recommends Brahmanas should learn from Shudra. Mahabharata supports learning highest dharma from them. So according to Manu and Mahabharata, Shudras can sometimes become teachers also, and a brahmana, if he gets a chance, should learn also from a shudra. So here we find again higher position of the shudras. By 19th century, shudras were untouchables. Brahmanas had unchecked power after kshatriya decline, called ignorant, poor, but tyrannical. So by 19th century, or by the British era, we find that Shudras were in the lowest rank of the society, and they were virtually untouchables, and Brahmanas were having all the power, followed by Kshatriyas. Orthodox Brahmanas wouldn't eat food cooked by others, only their mother, wife, or themselves. So, this is how the caste system from a very professional and rational system degraded, where we find Brahmanas would not eat food cooked by any other person who is not their wife, mother, or themselves. Real untouchables. Other castes were even worse off. Economically backward Shudras were mocked but respected Brahmanas out of fear and tradition. So, thus, we find how the position of Shudras were totally degraded by the 19th century. Legacy and contributions of Shudras. Now we are going to see what are the contributions of Shudras. So Shudra contribution to art. Hindu art was largely created by Shudras. So they were very good artists, and as we have discussed, many roles in leather work and crafts work were reserved especially for them. So they monopolized scripture, painting, architecture. Great temples and bronze icons are Shudra legacies. So, in the previous times during the early Vedic era, just like we give respect to laborers, but they do work which does not require a lot of intellectual knowledge. Similarly, Shudras were in that status. They did works of labor but were very much respected in the society. But as the history evolved, as we went forward, there the Shudras' position in the society declined. Shudras evolved metal casting techniques. Nataraja bronzes, their work adorn museums today. So they were very good craftsmen, and the Nataraja bronze statues are evidences of their craftsmanship. Sanskrit theatre. Though Brahmanas wrote Sanskrit plays, actors and actresses were mainly Shudras. Shudras had monopoly over Natya profession. So over the theatre and drama context, Shudras were dominant. They were actors and entertainers. Shudra women played Shakuntala and Sita. Orthodox literature mocked them, but they were crucial to stagecraft. So they were very much crucial in the context of drama and theatre. They even played important roles like Shakuntala and Sita. For them, they were mocked later, but they were very much good entertainers. Education gap. Male Shudras learned Sanskrit. Females often from less educated backgrounds spoke Prakrit reflected in stage roles. So male Shudras were even educated in Sanskrit, but such privileges were not given to the women Shudras. Despite social restrictions, Shudras preserved and advanced India's artistic, dramatic, and technical heritage. So it was due to the Shudras, many people don't know this, but whatever traditional artistic, dramatic, and technical heritage we have been mainly preserved by the Shudras. In some contexts, they had monopoly over a few sectors like stagecraft, metalworks, leatherworks, etc. Conclusion. Role of Vaishyas and Shudras. Here we are going to go through a summary of the entire presentation. We have already discussed all these things, so I am just going to read it out. Varna stratification. Ancient Indian society was hierarchically structured into Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras, as reflected in the Rig Veda and texts like the Purusha Sukta and Mahabharata. Vaishyas, economic backbone. Vaishyas held exclusive rights to Krishi, Goraksha, Vanijya, and Asari. Respected in epics like Ramayana, they were the wealthy class and supported society via taxes and trade. Shudras, from laborers to rulers. Initially assigned to service, Shudras gradually entered crafts, administration, and even kingship. Mahabharata and Kautilya recognized their military and economic roles. Caste based discrimination. Over time, especially post 9th century CE, Smriti texts like those of Shankar, Manu, and Yajnavalkya reinforced high caste rigidity. Shudras were barred from Vedic study, suffered legal inequality, and were often reduced to untouchable status. Cultural and artistic legacy. Despite marginalization, Shudras excelled in sculpture, bronze casting, drama, and temple arts. Natya roles in Sanskrit, theatre, and Nataraja icons exemplify their contributions to India's material and aesthetic heritage. Continuities and contradictions. Texts like Chandogya Upanishad, Tantra Vartika, and Mahabharata show both acceptance and exclusion, spiritual potential and systematic oppression, reflection reflecting the complexities of Vaishya and Shudra identities across time. Historical re-evaluation needed. From economic strength to cultural brilliance, the dogma acknowledging both subordination and agency across centuries. So that was how the Vaishyas and Shudras were very much important in the ancient Indian subcontinent. We have seen how their position was just a professional position in the beginning, and then it degraded to orthodoxy and untouchability. So thus we have discussed all the four main castes of the Hindu caste system. In our next videos we are going to discuss about the other castes which are not much known about. So please stay tuned and follow this video series so that you get important insights into the Hindu dharma and dharma of the Indian subcontinent. Thank you so much for your patience. Support me so that I can bring brighter contents in future.